So first off, hello everyone and welcome. I hope you all are well and enjoying these hot days in the middle of summer. Thank you all for tuning in today. Today is our third webinar in our series titled Lessons from the Field in a Time of Rapid Change and Crisis. Today's speaker will be Dr. Hannah Jaicks, who I will introduce here in a moment. Once again, my name is Ben Williamson, and I am the Executive Director here at the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative in Jackson, Wyoming. This is part 3 of our 6-part summer series. I mentioned this in our last 2 sessions, but I thought I would just quickly go back over some background for why we are hosting these. Put simply, NRCC as an organization is made up of a network of really fantastic folks working at the front end of science, education, and communication in the environmental and social fields. So we wanted to give several of these folks a chance to discuss their work and approaches. And they're definitely unique approaches, and hopefully the audience can come away with a new perspective on these arenas. And given the times we are in, we just felt it was appropriate to give these leaders a chance to make sense of and wrestle with the context that we're in. A few quick notes on logistics for everyone. These conversations will occur every other Thursday from noon to 1. Our last session will be September 24th. We are recording them and they will be up live on our website, available on YouTube. A little bit about the format. The conversations will be structured around 5 questions. I'll ask the question, allow the speaker the chance to respond, and then we'll leave 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. So as a question comes up for you, feel free to type them into the chat box, and then we will address them at the end of the conversation. That's all I have for logistics. So I'm gonna jump right into our introduction of our speaker, and then we'll get started. So today's speaker is Dr. Hannah Jaicks. Welcome, Hannah. Thank you for being here. Okay. So I'm going to do the introduction and then Hannah will dive in. So Hannah is an interdisciplinary scientist, currently the program director at Future West in Bozeman, Montana, where she was working on research and projects that aim to ensure the persistence of working landscapes that include farming and ranching and the healthy and abundant wildlife populations that exist here in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. What I find really interesting about Hannah is that she uses an explicit integrative method to her work that seeks to integrate and clarify the full range of people's stakes and interests, and ultimately wants to empower rural agricultural ways of living alongside wildlife. Some of her projects include right now a Northern Rockies Atlas of Conflict Prevention that seeks to reduce livestock predator conflict over the long term through awareness and adoption of non-lethal measures. She uses spatial and social methods, and she works to inform strategies that govern policy and science around predator and human populations. Hannah received her Ph.D. in environmental psychology from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, where she began work on the coexistence in the GYE. Prior to her doctoral work, she studied over 30 species of animals around the world, and inspired by a lifetime interest in the lives of the non-human animal and how they intersect with the growing footprint of human populations. And it was that interest that inspired her to begin work in the psychology of humans, with the goal of creating stronger forms of communication and inclusion for stakeholders within landscapes that contain wildlife. When not thinking about animals and humans, Hannah can be found coaching the Bozeman High School girls lacrosse team or working on a wool knitting project for her own business. And there's a hat right there. That's the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative hat. So thank you to Hannah for making that. So yeah, Hannah has a remarkable background and just an interesting story along with wildlife conservation and rural livelihoods. So I'm excited to hear her speak more to that. So once again, welcome to Dr. Hannah Jaicks, and thank you for being here today. And from there, we'll jump right in. You ready? Can you unmute yourself? Do I need to do that?
You had to unmute me, so I mean, it was nice listening to you talk about what I've done. I feel like you were very articulate, so I didn't mind.
I'm glad you're able to unmute yourself. Good. Okay, well, now that we got that out of the way, we can dive right in. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. So first question, in your own words, what do you do right now? And tell us how you got to where you're at, and why does this work matter to you? Sort of in a broad, general sense, however you'd like to take that.
So there's a lot of directions that I can go with that. And I think with the exception of my grad school friend who I saw as logged on, I think most people's first question is probably like, what's an environmental psychologist? And for me, I think, you know, I'm pretty sure my definition changes every time that I answer it. But the best way that I can relate to what that means is that it's the study of people in relation to the world around them. And in particular, I'm focused on people's relationships with animals. And as you kind of touched upon, I have been interested in that for most of my life, for as long as I can remember. And so it's who I am today has really been this interesting evolution of all of these experiences, and both positive and negative experiences that have really shaped who I am and how I do the work that I do. And everything sort of like there's the boundaries between what I do and who I am are very permeable, I have to say. And I know that you ask about that a little bit later, so I can hold off on that part of it. But just going back a little bit, I always joke that I was kind of a quirky kid because I'm an only child who like considered my pets my siblings. And so I spent a lot of time either reading or knitting, and someone had the good sense to hand me Jane Goodall's autobiography at a young age. And I also was obsessed with the show The Wild Thornberrys, which, just to date myself a little bit, it was about a girl whose parents were National Geographic filmmakers, and she had the ability to talk to animals, and her best friend was a chimp named Darwin. So you can read into that as much as you'd like, but that was just sort of such a formative aspect of my childhood. And because I had a lot of time to myself, I would just observe animals and the people and the world around me, because I didn't really have that many people to talk to all the time. And so from that became this curiosity. And as soon as I discovered that Jane Goodall she had that profession that she did studying chimpanzees in Gombe, I was like, I need to figure out how to do that. And so after then, I really started pursuing opportunities, and I talked my way into a lot of different positions at zoos, field stations, and aquariums with exotic animals that you mentioned, like hyenas, warthogs, penguins, and bats. And you know, I was really convinced, and this is something that not a lot of people know about me. So I went into college wanting to be a singer and a veterinarian, but no one had the good decency to tell me that I was actually a really bad singer. And so I spared my professors the hearing loss, and I took classes in psychology in addition to my biology major classes, and I fell in love with it. And so I found that psychology was just sort of this nagging interest that I couldn't shake, but I was still really focused on pursuing husbandry and behavior options with animals, and thinking that I wanted to do either animal behavior research or veterinary medicine. And the shift in my thinking really came in the first position after college, where I was working with great apes. So this is really one of those pivotal experiences for me, and it's a once in a lifetime opportunity that I fully recognize that it was just such a tremendous opportunity. And that was working with orangutans and gorillas. And one of the orangutans that I worked with spoke sign language. So I actually have a picture because he sits right next to my desk, and his name was Shantek. And so I spent the year assuming that I would be doing research that kind of helped me figure out where I wanted to apply to grad school or veterinary school, and just sort of figured I'd be on the trajectory that I was on. But again, this like psychology training that I had I could not let it go. And I was doing a lot of behavior research and a lot of cognitive research on gorillas and orangutans. And I was sort of getting jaded, because personally what I learned about particularly with orangutans, for instance, what I learned is that palm oil is used in everything from our shampoo to our milk to our Cheez-Its. And it's very sneaky. They changed the name of palm oil to things like vitamin A palmitate. And the problem with palm oil is that it comes at the expense of orangutan habitat. And I had no idea. And I'm somebody who's obsessed with great apes. And so what does that mean for everybody else who it isn't even a part of their day-to-day thinking? So I was doing all of this work evaluating empathy and cognition in great apes, and I didn't need to do this like positivist objective research to understand that apes had empathy. And I'm not saying that in an anthropomorphic way, I'm just saying that I understood that, like, I mean, anybody who has a dog knows that they pick up on your emotions. Like if you're having a bad day, your dog is going to sit in your lap and help you feel better. And so at the level of cognition that apes possess, I wasn't interested in pursuing research that a small group of people would be reading. I really wanted to pursue research that shifted other people's mindset the way that me learning about palm oil shifted my consumer behaviors. And so my plans really shifted, and I pursued graduate research at the CUNY Graduate Center because it was the only environmental psychology program in the nation. And admittedly, I didn't even fully understand what the program was when I did it, but it's the best decision that I ever made, in the sense that it really helped me reconcile a lot of the critiques that I had about traditional singular disciplinary research with regards to conservation, because it allowed me to, one, define my own position with regards to the issues that I care about, which is primarily humans and their relationship to animals, both wild and domestic, and then also do research that explored it. And I felt like it allowed me to answer questions that I was really particularly interested in, and come to the Northern Rockies and meet people like Susan Clark and get acquainted with the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative, and just expand my thinking to do work that really resonated with who I am. Because like I said, who I am professionally and who I am personally, they're not entirely separate things. And so nowadays, the work that I do with landowners, I'm writing a book that's basically a compilation. A lot of them really talk about the desire to have their story told. And so what I'm doing is trying, like, my passion now is shifting people away from the very polarized and dichotomized, whatever, dualistic, whatever buzzword you want to use for that, split thinking when it comes to conservation issues. And I really challenge people to understand that, like, you know, facts, and we can get into this, facts are definitely vehicles for political and scientific agendas. And so you have to understand them in the social, political, and ecological context that they're being used. And so if you want to address challenges on the ground, you need to, one, position and understand what that context is, and then consider the possibility that the two extremes that we're thinking about, a conservation challenge, that there's probably more to the story than that. And I'm trying to teach people to appreciate complexity through the means of storytelling. And I think the issue of ranchers as they relate to wildlife conflict, like wildlife conflict reduction, is a particularly ripe arena to do that, because there are so many assumptions and myths surrounding it. And what I'm doing is, after having done interviews for the last 3 years with ranchers, conservationists, agency staff, community members, is just helping unpack that and help people see a way through that's a lot more like just effective and less stuck in a lot of the public divides that I definitely don't find as interesting or enjoyable to engage with. So that's kind of the backwards and the forwards. So hopefully that explains what an environmental psychologist is. And if you have more questions about that, that's normal too.
That's a really fascinating story. And it, like, kind of, I mean, thinking about Jane Goodall and who she is and how her thinking has evolved into like the more moral and ethical components of conservation.
Yeah.
And how she started out as like a real behavioralist. Like, it's just interesting to hear that evolution, that you sort of have had a similar but albeit different one as well. And probably will continue to have like those palm oil moments like throughout your career, like when you realize that the story is much bigger than just like the specific species.
And that's a good thing. I mean, it takes some of the pressure off when you realize that there's no one size fits all. And also there's not a silver bullet. I mean, it'd be nice if there was, but there's just not for anything.
Yeah. One follow-up question would be like, how did your experience with really like hardcore science around animal behavior? How is that still helping you even today when you're working much more on the social science sort of things?
That's a good question. I talk about how I got sort of disillusioned with that.
Mhm.
I want to say, like, I still really love doing the behavior research. I mean, I got to sit on a deck looking at gorillas for 4 hours straight every single day. And that was fascinating to me, the same way it was fascinating to me to watch what my dogs were doing when a squirrel was in the yard at 13. So, again, like, I, I know that, like, that's a very quirky thing to say, but that's just still something I carry with me today. And I will say, like, that background in biology and chemistry and all of the other, like, physics, the training that I had to have, it does allow me to engage in conversation both with agency staff as well as the landowners, because their ecological knowledge is very specific to things like soil health and regenerative ag and livestock behavior. And so I think even though I situate myself much more as an interdisciplinary individual now, I still have a language with which I can talk to people that allows me an entryway into the conversation, because I understand where they're coming from and I understand how to translate how they're stuck and relate it to what they're working on. So I think it helps me work with other people, because not only do I understand how they're looking at the world, but I help them take that next step in thinking that somebody helped give me when I was in grad school. So I think it allows us to sort of bridge gaps in ways, because ultimately I think the thing that most people, and there's good and bad in everyone, and there's effective ranchers and there's effective conservation and there's the flip side too. But I think what it does is it also allows me to help different parties see that there's a lot more similarities, particularly with regards to stewarding the landscape, than they might think about. And I can use biological terminology to do that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And then could you just tell us briefly, like, what is your work with Future West involved? What does that look like?
Yeah, so it's varied. I think, right now it's not what it was for the last 3.5 years. But so as a project director, I help organize conferences and workshops around capacity building for community-based conservation groups. So you attended our training on how to be a community catalyst right in February, before we all were kind of turned inwards to our homes. And so I helped do, for better or for worse, like my graduate work, like the ways in which I was involved with this group. Oh my God, Nature Ecology Society. I think that work, actually organizing a colloquium, working with peers who, some of whom are on this call, that gave me the skill set in understanding like the theory and the rationale of like creating a conference and workshops where there's sort of an arc, so that people's experiences leave them with not only an understanding of a new issue, but also a way of going about how to address it. And then I facilitate a few different coalitions. So my favorite one that I work on is Montanans for Safe Wildlife Passage. And so, as you know, down in Wyoming, the issue of wildlife vehicle collisions is something that's a real threat to human safety, as well as wildlife safety and habitat connectivity. And so, again, my life is about humans' relationship to animals. And in this instance, it's working with agencies like the Montana Department of Transportation, the State Fish and Game Agency, and creating shared priorities and goals to address wildlife vehicle collisions in areas where there's a lot of hotspots, and also addressing the social challenges, because like with anything, there's a lot of fear and misperception around. I mean, connectivity and coexistence are two very loaded buzzwords, especially in rural communities, for one reason or another. And so I help facilitate those meetings, and that's something I've been doing for the last 3 years. And then I get to do this programmatic work. And the book is sort of the outcome of all the work, but I think, like with any qualitative research, the relationships and the ongoing interchanges that I have with everyone inform how I then go and orient myself when I attend conferences and workshops and meetings with others. So it also is a way for me to be a better, I don't like to use the word advocate, but it's a way for me to be a better steward of issues and challenging the thinking that predominates a lot of our work. So it's very adaptive in a lot of ways.
I really like that language, steward of challenges. I think that's an interesting way to frame that.
It's they're fun, I mean, I
Mhm.
love the people that I work with, even those that I fundamentally like disagree with our like practices when it comes to conservation stuff. I think it's really forced me to open my own thinking up, and that's
Mhm.
nothing but a good thing. I think we need that. So
Mhm. Well, thank you. There's a lot that we could rip off
yeah.
there, and I think we'll circle back to a lot of that.
Mhm.
So that was a great baseline. So we're gonna move forward to the second question. Um, and this is sort of a two-part question. The first being on a very basic level, just how has your own work been affected by the pandemic that we're in? And then the second part of that question, and this is the one where you can interpret however you'd like, but knowing that there are many other forces that are amplifying the pandemic, whether that be governance issues or force used against protesters or the upcoming election or the disregard for environmental regulations. There's just a lot going on right now in this moment.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I would love to hear you just kind of speak to how you're making sense of sort of the greater forces, whether that be the racial forces or social forces or governance, and how that relates to sort of your work right now and how it's changing your perspective on your work. So take that how you would like.
Yeah. No, it's when you first asked that question, it definitely, I thought of all the different ways that I could go with it. And I think, first of all, there's how I feel personally, and then there's also just kind of intellectually how I think about it. And, personally, like, this is coming from, like, I'm going to just like situate my own recognition of my privilege here and just acknowledge, like, for me, the big challenge is that it feels like it's Blur's Day every day and it's kind of Groundhog Day. So, I mean, if I'm not getting notifications or like checking my calendar, I kind of forget what day it is. And so I think that's been hard, is that my life lacks the structure that I'm used to. But again, like, considering that that's the challenge and that I miss engaging with my work so much. I feel fortunate that a lot of the people that I work with, the communities, the coalitions that I facilitate, a lot of those relationships are established, and so I am able to maintain them remotely, and I feel very fortunate for that. And I recognize that that is not the case for a lot of people, and that I know where my next meal is coming from, and I know that I have shelter, and that I am completely aware of how fortunate, and I'm completely grateful for how fortunate I am that that's the case. And I think in that regard, like, the fact that it feels like Groundhog Day for me, and the biggest challenge is that I miss engaging with people in person. That is personally how it feels, and it's challenging, but it's certainly not challenging to the degree that it is when I look at the broader scope of everything. And I think, the psychologist in me does have a lot of empathy for what is happening, because I can't help but see, like, just looking at things from like the feelings perspective, like, uncertainty and anticipation are the two most difficult feelings for people to tolerate. And our world is, at least on the pandemic specific level, like, we are filled with uncertainty and anticipation, and people are angry and they're scared. And we haven't all really, like, it's not something that we learn in our schools, how to like handle those kinds of emotion. And like, because the teachers already have so much on their plate, also teaching us emotional intelligence with regards to the degree of handling and encountering these complicated emotions, like, that is a lot on people's plate. And I have a lot of empathy for just how scary that is. And if you're not taught to handle your emotions, and they're so intimately connected to your actions, the violence that we're seeing, the rage, the like very like seemingly odd reactions to things like scientific recommendations around masks and social distancing, I think that that's a direct correlation to people's inability to like deal with their feelings. And I don't say that with any judgment. I say that with a lot of sympathy, recognizing that, like, wow, it's really hard and scary to be a person on a good day. And then we have this whole completely uncertain period of time that we're in that's compounding that fact. And then we have a media system and a policy process that reproduces polarity and feeds on fear. I mean, that's been the case since snake oils salesmen back in the day, like pandering on fear. People want to have a sense of control, And this is a period where there isn't a lot of control that we have. I mean, scientists are doing everything that they can to research a vaccine and understand it. And our understanding of the issue has evolved even since March, and I'm grateful for that. But there's still a lot that we don't know. And so I think where my heart breaks a little bit is just a lot of the what I would call counterproductive and like the volatile reactions as a result that like people are acting on their feelings and not their goals of just getting through this scary time. And I think it gets into like, you'll ask me like pieces of advice that I have later. And I think just going back to like fundamental mental health care, like I think it's severely lacking because people's ability to handle this situation is really struggling, and we don't have the resources or the capacity to enable people to manage that. And so I think there's that take on it. And then I think that like looking at a lot of the civil unrest that we're having, you know, I go back and forth a lot on this one, where I feel like the last thing that people, and it's funny like that I'm sitting here giving an interview as I say this tidbit, but like I think the last thing that people need is another like overeducated white woman telling people how to live their lives. Like, so when it comes to like me and my social media accounts, I tend to shy away from just sort of being very like I tend to not be very aggressive when it comes to like my views on stuff, because I just don't feel like this, it's not about me, like especially the civil unrest. Like it's my job to be listening and learning and understanding and to create space for somebody else to be holding the mic. And that's true both in my research and that's true in how I live my life. And I think that's true in general. And I think I have a responsibility. I think everybody has a responsibility to educate themselves and understand how I do and don't center my voice in situations. And I think, you know, something sticks out at me the other day. I saw a Sprite commercial that was different images of racial, sexual, gender minorities and all different minorities. And it was saying how like it was, we stand with you. And part of me was just like, you know, it was only a matter of time before they commodified the civil rights movement of 2020. And I can't help but be like, you know, that feels awfully performative. Like if you want to actually stand in solidarity, incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusivity into your business program measures. And I sincerely doubt that like Jeff Bezos or the owner of Coca-Cola is doing that. And so I can't help but get annoyed when I see those commercials, because I don't think that that's improving representation, and I don't think that that's building the type of change that people are hoping to see. I think it's commodifying the same way that we commodify nature and commodify bodies and commodify people. So I might be a little cynical on that one, but I think that sometimes the best thing to do is to not say anything and to listen and listen some more and listen some more, and then see what it might mean, that like what it might be that you need to do and how you can be supportive and how you can elevate the voices of others. So it's kind of a harsh perspective, but I really didn't, yeah, I can't help but think that when I see those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. That's really, I think that requires a lot of self-awareness to pull yourself out of wanting to center yourself always within when getting all these signals from the world that you need to perform and participate and to show the world that you are whatever you are. And I think that's a good point, is just that sometimes it's the best thing to do is just to stop and listen. And so I really appreciate that and think that's really wise. And especially thinking about like at the beginning of the movement in June, or not the movement, this moment in June, like social capital really rose up high, and you could launch onto it and you could build your own social capital. And then now there's like the second wave of like, now there's financial capital to be made.
Yeah.
If you buy in, and that's like what these companies and corporations are doing. So
yeah.
So that was really great response, and I think actually leads to the next question that I want to ask. So the third question, kind of bringing it back to the GYE and NRCC, and that we've sort of always worked to promote sort of a holistic approach to environmental work and trying to make the connection between what we've called environmental problems and what we would rather just call human problems of decisions and practices that shape people's values and expectations. And I know that you work in rural landscapes oftentimes, and like any place that requires the navigation of political and social norms that maybe you are not familiar with or not necessarily also a part of. So my sort of two questions with this is, how do you seek to be contextual, and how, and related to your previous response, how do you be a good listener in those contexts? And then the second is, more simply, is just how do you relate to the people you work with when they come from very different backgrounds than yourself?
Those are good questions, and keep me on track if I go left of center with answering them. I just also want to, like, I think some of it, just to kind of speak towards the value of groups like NRCC. I mean, I met Susan Clark, who, for people listening who don't know who that is, like, she was my graduate advisor, and she was also one of the fundamental people responsible for starting NRCC. And I think what I've always valued about that is that it's a home to encounter other thinkers who don't necessarily fall into like a neat little box. And there's been a long time where I felt like I didn't have other, like I've always sort of struggled to articulate the value of that research and that approach to everyone before I got to grad school and before I met folks like the group at NRCC. And again, I keep citing my peer who's on the call, but like Hugh and my other friends like Shruti and Scott and Jen and Bryce, they all were really formative in helping shape my thinking. And a lot of the ways in which I try to be contextual, it is born out of the training that I have, where I guess just to go back a step, like I am not your traditional like hypothesis driven positivist objective researcher. I've done research like that. I think that there's a value to that. Like I think there's never a substitute for good data, but I think that that alone is not sufficient to tell a good story that's compelling or complete. And so in grad school, I remember reading this paper by this woman named Karen Barad. It's 2003, if somebody feels like looking it up. And she introduces the idea of the prism. And so when you look at a prism, there's the light that goes into it, and then there's a rainbow that typically comes out of it, and that's called diffraction. And so as people, even with the most objective driven research, we're still people with a set of experiences, a set of understandings, and a way in which we look at the world and experience it. And so when we take in information, that clear light, and when we produce it to the world for education, information, whatever, it's diffracted, whether we like it or not. And so that can be viewed as a weakness. And I think a lot of objectivity is very like sketched out by subjectivity instead of viewing it as the possibility for a strength. Like, know who you are. That's like the biggest thing that psychology teaches you, is like, know who you are and know what your goals are. And so the ways in which I try to be contextual is understand that like all of what I just got done telling you 20 minutes ago about who I am and how I look at the world really shapes, one, how I introduce myself to people, one, how I think about the issues that we're talking about, and how I make sense of it. And so I think, like, for instance, this book that I'm writing, and when I wrote my dissertation, there's an entire section clarifying the observational standpoint that I have. And I think I do that on purpose so that people know that what they're reading is the product of this lens that I'm analyzing the world through. And rather than that being a weakness, it's really allows people to understand the issue in the context that I'm presenting it in. And when it comes to doing the type of research that I do, it's called iterative or grounded. And just to kind of unpack what that is I have this idea in my head. When I started this research 3 years ago, and it was really born out of the stuff that my dissertation produced, which was why carnivore management is so divisive. And so I still had this lingering question, like, okay, well, if it's so divisive, then how are people overcoming that division? Like, how are they mediating that space, that physical space, that social space, that political space, in order to maintain their livelihoods, but also create space for the wildlife that are there on the landscape? What allows them to do that? Because it's definitely not money alone. It's definitely not scientific facts alone, because there's plenty of that information. And there's also clear funding resources. And so what I tried to do from that is to start to form an idea in my head. And so then I went and introduced myself to people in like, I mean, you have to sort of be fearless when it comes to showing up as yourself. And so I introduced myself to a few ranchers that then became dear friends of mine, whose kids that I like hang out with when we go deliver hay. And I don't say that with any excessive romantic, like I'm not overly romanticizing their life. I just mean that they're people that I built a relationship with, even while we disagree on some issues. And so that in turn, they helped me structure the interview questions. And they told me things to not ask, like never ask a rancher how many sheep or cattle they have, never ask how big their property is, because that's like asking how much money's in their bank. And it's like, oh shoot, like that would have been the first thing that I would have asked them. So good to know. And that back and forth exchange also loosened up some of their attitudes about this kid from suburbia. And I think it shifted their attitudes. And so it's this back and forth exchange. And that led to then, okay, after I piloted that work, I was then able to do interviews with a bunch of different people up and down the western side of Montana. And then from there, I would follow up. And that back and forth, that iterative process is now what the book's meat is. I didn't mean to, I think I unconsciously used the word meat because I'm writing about cattle, but that's what the bulk of the book is really about. And so it's that back and forth process, and the means of engaging is recognizing that they have their own way of doing things and I have mine, but I'm gonna mess up when I talk to people. And I mean, I don't drink, for example, and so much of like the time that ranchers can engage and connect with people is in the bars and the saloons, and I don't. So going to those spaces but drinking like a Coke, they had to give me a hard time for that. And it was like, fine, I'm going to give you a hard time back. Like, and I think finding the humanity in the work and navigating that space is where the richness of that and like it or not, the data that I have are empirical. They're just situated and they're not hypothesis driven, but I would argue that they're incredibly strong because they are based on a very adaptive process that allowed for the question to generate itself rather than to drive in with the question and fit a square peg into a round hole.
That's really interesting. And yeah, it brings up a lot of questions for me. But thinking about your book, I'm curious, like, how are you thinking about presenting what to you is clearly a subjective account of this dynamic of coexistence, when you know the readers will assume that it is like sort of an objective take on this dynamic. So like how do you, and you sort of tapped on it a little bit with like explaining that you need to clarify your standpoint, but yeah, I just like, am curious, like how do you present that type of science that we're so not familiar with?
My strategy typically is to use vignettes and stories to interweave theory into it. So what I like to do whenever I write is I use, and I do this with other writings that I have. If you ever feel like looking me up, like reading more about what I do, you see that I tell stories to kind of introduce an idea. So a big thing in the first substantive chapter is place attachment and place identity. And I talk about, and this is actually borrowed straight from my dissertation. I talk about this environmentalism of everyday life. So the ways in which we live, work, and play, and steward is the fourth piece that I add, really shapes our relationship to how we relate to animals. And so I introduce stories of ranchers living on the place, working on the place, playing. And I use examples because like my interviews alone are one piece of it, but like what the people who I interview don't know, actually they do now, but like at the time, is that it's also the fact that we do our interviews while we're driving in a truck and we're going to like close a gate and move cattle. Like, and so that experience while I'm interviewing them becomes a part of the story. And so I introduce these very like visually rich like narratives to then introduce theoretical concepts that make my point, because I think it helps people engage with otherwise. If I was just to say like place attachment and place identity and what's another theme, like the mythology around like wolves and cattle and things like that, people would be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But when you put it in the context of a story, of a person's story who lives and exists today, you're able to relate to it, I think, and the people themselves can relate to it. So I integrate experience with theory.
And then, so how does that tailor into you presenting like the non-lethal approaches? Like, how do you actually present those ideas to people that may not agree with that?
To, when you say the people who don't agree with the non-lethal approaches,
maybe ranchers who are not on board with those sort of control measures yet, or for a lethal approach to those conflicts. I'm just like, how do you, reading through your bio, it seemed like that you also want to promote some sort of practice at the end. So I'm just curious, like, what's that process after sort of getting to know and building that relationship?
I think, you know, it's rare for me. Like, I can't ever imagine myself going up to a rancher and saying like, you should be using fladry on your property. Like, and fladry, for context, is it's this really cool electrified fencing and like red flags that are really good during calving and lambing seasons for repelling wolves, because wolves hate new things, and so it sets them off and it keeps them out of their calving pens. So it's not that I would ever go tell somebody what to do. It's usually I ask like, okay, tell me why you aren't using that, and why do you do what you do? And usually there's some rationale, and whether it's, I'm never going to say valid or not, whether there's a scientific basis for it or not, it's still their approach. And so then I get into questions of like, well, have you ever considered this? What would it take to shift that? And I think what I do is I more gradually introduce the possibility that there's more than one way to approach the issue. And like, well, what are the resources you'd need to do that? What are the community measures? Like, because I think we underestimate how much the conflicts are like geographically situated, like temporally, physically, socially, politically, ecologically. And so a rancher who's dealing with a conflict in the Madison Valley of Montana versus the Rocky Mountain front, they're two different landscapes. I mean, landscapes vary a few miles down the road from each other. And so when it comes to introducing the resources, it's usually asking them, what is it going to take for you to shift, and why won't you? And understanding that like, I might not get an answer I want to hear the first time. Like, it's not going to be like, you know what, you've changed my life. Like, I've been on this place for 6 generations. Like, I'm on board. And I don't go in there expecting that, but I do go in there understanding that I've established a relationship that they're now engaged with, whether they like it or not. Like, they're not going to get rid of me. And so then there's going to be continuing discussions. And I think that a lot of people want change to happen overnight, and nothing good happens overnight. Like, very rarely it does. And so it's understanding that like, these collaborative movements that I write about are ones who've changed people's behaviors over like 3 decades, over a lot of time. It's seeing your neighbor do use livestock guardian dogs and see that it works, see that they had fewer losses, see that the person who works for the federal agency bringing in fladry isn't going to leave you with the bill next year. So I think there needs to be a change in how our scope of time is viewed. And that allows for more avenues to open up, and it allows for like, attitudes shift very slowly. Like, you're not going to get somebody who hates wolves to like wolves the next day. And I don't expect to change the hearts and minds of people who have seen ranchers who have like degraded the landscape. But behaviors change. Like, you can change behaviors a lot quicker, and you don't need somebody to like what they're doing to change their behavior. Like, it makes it a lot easier. But I mean, there's plenty of, I think a lot of folks get hung up on especially when it comes to the environmental advocacy, I think we get really hung up on wanting people to like something than we do just getting them to do it. I don't like eating a well-rounded meal. I'd rather eat ice cream every night for dinner. Anybody who knows me knows that's true, but I do eat a real dinner because I know that I'm supposed to. And so how I feel doesn't really matter. And I think a lot of ranchers, especially the ones that I'm writing about, and granted it's a self-selected subset, but they are people who understand that there is they don't have to like the animals. They don't have to be happy about the wolf reintroduction. They don't have to feel the same way that I do about grizzly bears. I mean, I have like a billion bear cards behind me. Clearly, I have my own opinions on stuff, but feelings don't matter, your actions do. And I think if we get people to have those conversations, engage in those dialogues, attend the community meetings, and consider the possibility that they might do something differently, I can't sit here and say that I've changed the hearts and minds of everybody, but I can sit here and say that I've established relationships with people and I've participated in collaboratives that actually have shifted behaviors and mindsets. But the mindsets came a lot later, and they're not even necessary. Like, it's just what matters is that you're willing to participate and consider the option. And when you see your neighbors doing it, when you see that you're not going to get left saddled with the bill, that you're not going to be the only one responsible for maintenance, that the public recognizes the value of your stewardship capacity, that you're motivated to participate in regenerative ag practices, like all of those things coalesce to behavior change and maybe attitude change, but that's not the important piece of it.
That was an excellent response, and I took a lot of really concrete pieces away from that.
Okay.
In order to leave some time for some questions at the end,
oh yeah,
I'll ask you our last final question before we open it up to everybody. And so the last question, what are 3 pieces of advice that you would like to offer the audience and the greater world? That can be books, stories, people, influences, whoever you'd like to take that, but what would you like to offer us?
Okay, so you broke up a little bit, but I can. You broke up a little bit, but I think I got the gist of that. And I think everybody is going to know what my first answer is. And the first piece of advice or thing that I would recommend is to just destigmatize our relationship to mental health care. I really wish we would institutionalize support for mental health practices the way we have. And I mean, our health insurance, that's a whole other conversation, but like, I think I'd really like to see our relationship to how we view taking care of our mental health shifted, because you have to put on your life vest before you put on the person next to you. Like, I think in order to be able to do the type of work that I do, I couldn't do it if I wasn't also like talking to a counselor as well. And I think that there's so much fear around that and shame. And I wish that we did not have that, because it's just, there's nothing to be ashamed about with that. I think it's a real strength, just like I think it's a strength to know who you are, to know what you struggle with, because you're a person in the world just trying to figure it out like everybody else. I think the other thing is that, and this is primarily a piece of advice for graduate students, but for anybody starting work, is like I said, I've always loved animals and wanted to figure out how to work with them and people's relationship to them. And when I was in grad school, a peer of mine who's like a senior to me, his name is Jack, he was like, well, you know, the issues that you're dealing with aren't going to go away anytime soon. So if you want to start it and not feel too overwhelmed, ask yourself, what's the first question that you want to answer? Answer that one, and then think about the next question that you want to answer based on what your first question led you to find. And I've always found that really helpful, because it sort of takes me from trying to like distill all of this information and make sense of everything to dialing it down to one concrete thing that I can focus on, especially if you're somebody who tends to get in your head a lot, which I may or may not do. I think it's a very helpful heuristic that I rely on and I recommend to everybody else. And then also just to stay open in the process. Like I felt like the way in which I looked at the world was something problematic for the longest time. And now it's actually like the untraditional, whatever you want to call it, my means of approaching my work. It's actually the thing that I take the most pride in. Like I really respect my process and I value it. So I think trust your process, and trust that if you don't fit into a single box, it doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. It just means that you're yourself, and to work on accepting it as quickly as possible. And to do so, see advice number 1. So that's it.
Oh, those are great. I think sum up a lot of what you've already spoken to. So thank you so much for those 3. I will personally be reflecting on all 3, because I think they definitely resonate so much with all of our work and education and moving forward in our careers. So thank you for that, Hannah. We've got some really good questions here. So
Yeah.
I'm just gonna dive in here.
Yeah.
First one is, earlier you sort of hesitated to qualify yourself as an advocate. Could you just tell us why?
Yeah. So Rich, thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate that. It's more so, I feel like I tend to shy away from specific labels in general because I think that, you know, the way in which the term advocate started is like really awesome. Like it started to, like, especially in the early environmental movement in the 70s, and you could argue earlier than that. Like I think it started it with like a very clear set of intentions and motivations. And I think I am sort of loosey-goosey about any sort of singular identity because I think what an advocate means to me could be something that potentially differs from somebody I'm trying to work with. And my definition of an advocate is someone who feels very strongly about our relationship to the natural world and helping make the world a better place, because I think it's more interesting when I'm not the only one that's in it. And I value diversity of species and people. And I don't think that that's the definition that everybody else has. And so it's not so much that I shy away from the term advocate, it's that I shy away from trying to define myself in a singular term, especially terms that these days I feel like the two extremes use for their own respective agendas. But I say that with respect for, like, if somebody does define themselves that way, like, and that helps you orient yourself, like, I have a lot of respect for that. Like, I don't think that there's a right or a wrong way to define yourself. I think I just tend to not put myself with a singular label because I'm so, like, I'm so squeamish about that. And I think it's probably I spend too much time analyzing what words mean. For instance, I don't use the word coexistence when I'm interviewing landowners because to them that is very threatening. I'll use the term shared landscapes. And you can get into the semantics of whether or not it should be that way. Like I don't think coexistence and connectivity should be the scary buzzwords that they are, but they are, in the same way that sustainability and like even just like the like the thing that I mentioned with the Sprite commercial, like solidarity, for example, like it just, they get so, there's a term in social theory and I cannot remember it, but they get perverted or polluted. And so I am an advocate at the end of the day. I just don't state that I am because I am just so overly cautious, and maybe I shouldn't be. So Rich, I appreciate you challenging me on that one.
Yeah.
So I'll
And
keep wrestling with it.
it is a loaded term in many spaces. So the next question, I think this refers to the pandemic or sort of new world order that we're in. So
it's a great question.
Is how have some of your stakeholders, are some of your stakeholders that you work with facing new threats to their livelihoods? However you'd like to answer that.
No, that's a great, Marissa, that's a great question. I think, you know, something that I've been in a lot of my conversations is around the anxiety around food supply chain. So like, for instance, my boyfriend's family, they have cattle and they're trying to figure out, like, do they hold up, like they took a gamble and got more cattle, but now the market is so poor. So what do they do in that situation? So personally, there's a lot of anxiety around those decisions of like, okay, do we sell? Do we hold? Like there's such a, the fragility of our food supply chain has become so apparent. And I've been wrestling with whether or not I should even try to incorporate that into my book, because that is a book in and of itself. Just, we have these bottlenecks in our processing plants, and we have these monopolies over a very few set of people who control this like very small section of the supply chain. But you have these producers who don't know if they should go to like regional processing and small processing plants because people can't get their meat at Costco. Well, if you do that and then people are able to then go back to getting their meat, you just like killed a bunch of cattle that you now then can't sell. So you did it for no reason and you lose money on that. But then if you don't, and then you can't get the money to put your cattle through the broader supply chain, you lose money that way. So that's that. And then for a while, people were having trouble accessing the meat and the produce that they needed in order to survive. Yet producers and farmers and ranchers were having to like drain milk, throw out crops, kill cattle and pigs. And so there was this like two-sided issue to that. And I think it certainly hasn't gone away. I'm a part of a lot of conversations about the value of a regional processing facility, because I think people recognize from this pandemic that like we cannot continue to operate with this like very limited bottleneck in our processing facilities. And then you can get into the issue like folks like Temple Grandin who have highlighted opportunities for like, it might sound like an oxymoron to some, but like humane slaughter. Those big factories don't provide that capacity. And so I think that there's an opportunity to find a more localized approach that takes away some of the vulnerability of our food supply chain. I think it's just something that is so complicated that I'm still trying to make sense of, and the ranchers are still trying to make sense of, and the consumers are. And so I think there's an opportunity to come out of this situation where we shift our approach to food supply. And I think local agriculture has a potential. And stay tuned for the book to talk about the value of regenerative ag with regards to climate, because the whole issue of cattle and methane is a whole story for a whole different day. So
Thank you. That was great too. Last question before we wrap up, and this is a great ending question. The question is, how has Jane Goodall influenced you in the way you are today?
So, Mark, that was a good question. I think, you know, I grew up in a very suburban area, and I knew I had this love of the natural world. But I think what I've always, and you know, I don't even always agree with all of Jane Goodall's like policies and ideas, but I agree with her as a person and what she stands for. And what I've always valued about her is she opened up to me the possibility that there's so much more out there and so many opportunities for types of work that I could do. And I'm forever grateful for that. I managed to convince my school to let me miss class so I could drive 8 hours to go see her talk and like introduce myself to her in high school. And it was still the best experience of my life, because I got to meet this person who showed me what's out there. And I've never really forgotten that. Even the ways in which we like, I have my own North Star and my own compass. Like I've always been grateful that there's this person out there that has this curiosity about the world. And at the time, it was ridiculous for somebody to ascribe emotion and empathy and capacity to apes and animals outside of humans, let alone name them. And so she pioneered so much and created such an opportunity. And she was a woman without a degree. And so I think it was her curiosity and her courage that really told me that like, okay, like start chasing after something and see where it takes you. And, you know, I think it's really been something that I value and I hold close to me, because it's, I don't know, maybe I still would have ended up here had I not read her book, but I think it was sort of a kind of kismet thing that I found. So I just appreciate who she is and what she stands for.
Yes, like I just listened to a podcast with her and still find her so inspiring every time I hear her. So
yeah. Oh, she's so
good. Yeah. Well, with that, I think we'll wrap up. Thank you, Hannah, for talking with us today. That was fascinating and provided so much fodder to keep thinking about. I have like 100 million follow-up questions that I will follow up with you, but I'm sure people that are listening will too. So
yeah, please do.
Too.
You're welcome to share my email with people too. And I value the feedback and the questions, because I think it's good to have my thinking challenged. So.
Absolutely. So I would like to take a moment just to advertise our next session, which is going to be on Thursday, August 27th, with Molly Loomis Tyson, who is also a research associate with us here. And I think it's actually going to really build on what you introduced around place identity. Molly is a writer, teacher, and has been a climbing ranger in the Tetons since 2001. And now she's finishing up a master's degree and moving back to Teton Valley in Idaho right now. But she writes really eloquently on connection to place, and has written for many major publications. So she's going to be fascinating, and I think we'll build on some of these same themes. So I hope everyone that is on this call will join us in 2 weeks. And until then, I hope everyone has a safe and healthy several weeks. And once again, thank you to Dr. Hannah Jaicks for joining us. That was really great. So really
Thank you for
appreciate it.
having me.
Yeah,
It was really fun. So thanks for the questions, everyone.
awesome. All right, thank you everybody, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye.
Bye.